Okay, the cleaning process. I just use naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, and basically what we're trying to achieve is to remove any dust, dirt, grease, oils, any contaminants at all from these components. Now here I'm working on a green serviette, not because it's efficient, but because my video camera will automatically adjust itself for the exposure regardless of what I tell it to do. And if I use a white paper napkin, everything else will be too dark for you to see. I'd like some nice Kodak 15%, 80% grey or whatever they were, I can't remember what the number was now. 15% grey napkins, they'd be ideal. So I'm just cleaning these pieces with naphtha, and you'll notice I'm holding them by the edges. If I was being exceptionally enthusiastic, I'd probably be wearing finger cots or rubber gloves, but really that's going above and beyond. And the reason you don't want to just clamp them firmly between finger and thumb is that you will leave fingerprints on these components if you do, and the skin oils will etch into that surface over time and leave indelible evidence that it was you that did the job. This plate, as you can see, is quite marked. That's the underside of this plate. It goes against nothing, is never seen, and so its ugliness is neither here nor there. And here's the case. Now this is filled with all sorts of atrocious rubbish, because unlike a watch, a camera shutter is open to the elements, and all the dust and dirt, all the sand from holidays at the beach, all finds its way in. Not to mention all the grease, and there's always grease that was used when the shutter was first assembled, grease that well-minded individuals have applied. And it always migrates to where you don't want it to be. That's just the nature of oils and so forth, they migrate. So if I get this case clean, it may not look $1 million when I'm done, but it's mostly hidden under other stuff, so that doesn't matter, as long as it's clean from a functional point of view. It's important to get oils and grease off components like this, because if you don't, as soon as your back's turned, they'll take the opportunity to migrate to where you really don't want them, which would be on the shutter blades, for example. Which brings us to the shutter blades problem. Here we have 5 blades here. The 4 that were still in the shutter and the one that had fallen out and had been saved for me. First thing I'm going to do is clean these with a bit of naphtha to remove any dirt from them and give me a chance to inspect them. See just how bad they are. There's rust on these blades. It certainly looks objectionable, and there's other marks. And they are going to have to be polished. Some of these blades will clean up quite well. And some of them may not. But I don't have any spare blades for the shutter. Or well, the only spare blades I've got are in much the same condition, because they've come from a similar camera where the blades are open to the atmosphere. Most shutter blades in old rangefinder cameras are interlens blades, if you like. They live inside the lens between the front and the rear groups, and as a result they're not open to the atmosphere to the same extent, and they're certainly not open to random splashes and fingerprints and other problems. Okay, so these blades are not looking very promising. I can see a lot of rust coming off here. They are going to have to be polished now, so I'll get some Brasso metal polish and I'll start with blade number 1. This is what I'm using. It works well for me. Well, this blade looks like one of life's casualties. Let's see how we go. Now you'll hear that noise. That rough noise is the cotton bud running over the rough surface of that shutter blade. Now this is a bad example of a shutter blade. If it was better than this, this process it'd go quiet, like this part of the blade. There's hardly any noise compared to this. There's some stubborn lumps and bumps on this side of the blade. This side's good. This side is not. The nice pretty black finish on the blades may well suffer if you're polishing them to this extent. But they do need to be smooth, otherwise they won't move correctly. They will not move as smoothly as they should do, which will probably affect your high speeds. Well, I'll carry on with this process and bring you back when I've got that blade as good as I'm going to get it. Okay, so there's the blade I've been cleaning. You can see it's a long way from perfect, but it's acceptable. That was the worst of the blades. The second worst blade is this one here. So I expect that this will clean up better than this one did. This blade is almost certainly the blade that had fallen out of the camera, and so it had been handled. It had been picked up, squeezed between finger and thumb, and spent its life in this little plastic container, which looks very old and yellow, and it's anyone's guess how long ago this terrible incident happened. So that blade there is as good as I'm going to be able to get that. It's not wonderful, and you can see the discoloration there because some of the area is no longer black. It's no longer black because the rust is effectively eaten through the surface. Of course, I've got to hold it up to the light and make sure there's no pinholes. No, there's no pinholes. It's still a solid blade, and it'll certainly move smoothly enough now that all its lumps and bumps have been polished away, but it's not what you'd like to see in your camera if you look. So I'll do the other blades. Well, they're a long way from perfect, but they're a lot better than they were. So those shutter blades will do fine for reassembling the shutter with, and in an ideal world, of course, you'd probably replace those with new blades. But in the world we live in, probably 70 years after this camera was made, you do the best you can with what's on hand. Right, so that's the blades cleaned. I've got the case cleaned. I need to clean the mechanism plate next, I think. So for the mechanism plate, I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time on this. As you can see, there's a lot of dust and dirt and grease, old grease on these surfaces, and I'm going to have to get this cleaned. Now when you're cleaning this with a cotton bud, be aware of this spring and be careful not to damage it. It's not easy to get back in place if you just get it off, which is why I don't want to remove it. But all of this mechanism plate I've got to clean to get rid of the old oil and all the grit and rubbish that's in this shutter. So just swab all the available surfaces to get rid of all the contaminants you can see, and I'll show you how I deal with the speed trains after that. In an ideal world, I'd probably pop the whole thing into the ultrasonic cleaner into some naphtha, but I know that if I do, that black paint in there will disappear and I'll have to paint it back in. So I don't want to do that. That's trouble. So I'll just swab this, get it all clean, get rid of all that filth, which you can't see because the camera's not focused. See if we can get this better. No, that would be too easy. Well, as you can see, I've got that quite clean now. Now to clean these trains, these gear trains, what I'm going to do is just pour in a little bit of naphtha. This is the speed train there, holding back the pallets here, holding that lever out, which removes the pallets from the train. I'll just swing this multiple times, take my rocket blower, blow out all that naphtha, do it again. Now working that mechanism, when it's soaked in naphtha, will loosen up any contaminants that are on the surfaces, the mating surfaces. And blowing away the naphtha means that you're also blowing away the contaminants and the oils and other rubbish that is suspended in the naphtha. If you just soak something in naphtha and then just leave it, eventually the naphtha will evaporate and you'll be left with exactly the same contaminants that you started off with. Of course, we want them out. So that's moving nice and freely, and if I charge it or set it by swinging it across at this point, and if I just lift the pallets at this end slightly, you'll hear the speed train run down smoothly. So that's the speed train, and this one here, that's our self-timer or delay action. And basically, same thing again. Pour some naphtha in there. This is different because you don't have a lever to move. I'm just going to use the tip of a screwdriver to gently pull that wheel around. And again the same. Blow away the naphtha. And I'll do that again. Here we have the pallet for the flash sink mechanism, and here I've done the same thing really. I've just flooded that with naphtha, blown it away with the rocket blower to make sure that there is no grease in particular. If you get grease underneath that little pallet there, it won't move at the same rate. There'll be too much resistance, it'll be slow. So it needs to be free moving. But that's our mechanism plate all nice and clean now, and as a result that's ready to have the blade actuating ring and its control lever and things put back in place. These components just need to be swabbed with naphtha. Here's the blade actuating ring. This, as you can see, is a lot of black coming off there. That's almost certainly graphite grease that someone has put on there during a previous service, or vaguely possible that it's original, but most likely some repairman's put that in there at some stage. And I would say that they've been somewhat heavy-handed with it. You need very little lubricant for something like that. Right. So we have its retaining plate here. This is also the plate that the shutter blades pivot on. And this surface needs to be nice and clean. Here we want all the oils and rubbish off it, so that the blades aren't sticking to it in any way. From the underside, this is the side that the blade actuating ring runs against. That should be nice and clean. We'll need minimal amount of lubrication in there, and I typically lubricate those with dry graphite, usually graphite powder, but you can use a graphite pencil, a soft graphite pencil, and apply some graphite to the mating surfaces with that. That also works very well. The advantage of using a dry lubricant like graphite is that it doesn't attract and stick dust and grit like a wet lubricant, a grease or an oil will. Okay, well that's all good. And here's the lever from the top of the mechanism plate that moves our blade actuating ring. So I'm just cleaning this to remove the grease and rubbish that's on it. That's nice and clean now. And the blade actuating ring can be put back together. Alright, so lubricating the blade actuating ring. You've got a few choices here. I'll put this in place, show you where it fits. There's a stud sticking out at one side. It drops into that slot there. Now, as you can probably see, the blade actuating ring fits snugly around the inside edge, around the inner edge. On the outside edge there's quite a clearance there between the ring and the body. So there's absolutely no reason to put any lubricant around the outside edge of that blade actuating ring. It just simply couldn't do anything except cause you trouble. So the surfaces we're interested in are the inside of the diameter, the top surface and the bottom surface. Those are the only surfaces that can have any bearing on lubrication. What can you do? Well, as I say, you can use graphite powder. You can use a soft lead pencil like this, in which case I would take it and run the lead around the inside edge. You can do the top surface. That's where the plate's going to retain it. Like that. The bottom surface you can do the same. Now what are you doing? Basically you're just applying a little bit of graphite for all practical purposes to those surfaces. And it'll act as a lubricant. You can do the same job with graphite powder. Probably buy it in a container like this. Nice and cheap, buy it at just about any hardware store. Used, or locksmiths, it's often used for lubricating locks. So that's got all the lubricant it really needs. Here's our retainer plate, only goes on one way. It's got a little rivet underneath the bottom surface which drops into a slot there. You've got to line up the screw holes, of course. There's only one way you can get this thing to fit. Let's get this seated. That's popped down into position. There's 3 retaining screws. We had 2 short screws and 1 long. Now, the long screw was over here by that speed train from memory. So the short screws must be over here. So I'll just run those in. If I can get the thread to start. Not today. Let's do the other one. That screw is simply not picking up. It's this plate slightly moved. That's better. And the longest of the 3 screws went over here by the self-timer or delay action. So those 3 screws ran in, and noticeably the long screw ran in without any problems. Now, why do you have 3 different lengths of screw? Well, this one by the speed train, that's come up through quite a thick section of the casting. So the end of the screw is not exposed, it's not touching anything. The other 2 screws, one is here. That comes up in a recess, it comes up in a thin part of the casting. You don't want the screw sticking up in there, it'll foul something. Likewise the other one, which is here, falls into this channel down in here. Again, it's a thin casting, you wouldn't want the long screw there. It would end up fouling something. So I've got the 3 screws in position. I can nip those up tight. We can check the blade actuating ring for freedom of movement. As you can see, it moves very freely. Let's flip this over. The lever that works the blade actuating ring is this thing. Lubricating this. Well, you don't want to smother it in grease, it'll only make it sticky. It pivots on this point, on that post, and this little slot here picks up the pin on the blade actuating ring. Those are the only two areas we need to be concerned about. What I typically use to do this job is some molybdenum paste. Rocol Dry Molybdenum paste it's called, and you need very little of it. Get that seated in place, and it has a retaining screw, got quite a large diameter head on it. If you had a shim washer under there on your shutter, that needs to be put back. There certainly wasn't one here, and they're not particularly common, but they do, from time to time you find them, and the reason you'll find them is just to take up a little bit of extra slack because of manufacturing tolerances. So that's all together, and the blade actuating ring is now, so I hooked that return spring back on there, I didn't tell you about that. So that blade actuating ring is all back together now and working. We'll pop that to one side for the moment, because we need to assemble this case. And the case, we had two pieces that went in there. Had this piece, see if we can get this in position. The screws for that, well, there were two fairly long screws that went in on that plate. And the reason they're fairly long is that the casting at that point is quite thick. And so you can have screws with a decent sort of a length to them without it causing any issues. So they're in place. Now I haven't tightened them yet, I'm just checking. I'm turning over the casting, you can see the screw there. It's below the surface, just below the surface. So it's not fouling anything. Nip those two screws up. Now how tight do you do them up? Well, that's something that you only get from experience really. The feel to how tight things need to be. They don't need to be very tight. I once worked with a bloke and he just couldn't get it, and every tiny screw on the camera he would be putting his whole shoulder behind it, and he spent all his life dealing with stripped out holes and things of that nature. Now this plate will only go in one position. We've got three fixing screws that go in there. They are not equidistant. Let's see if I can find out where they go. There. 1, 2, 3. This plate, there are little indentations in this plate. That's where the pivots for the blades go. And we've got three screws that hold this plate in place. The plate's recessed slightly where the screws go, but they are recesses, they are counterbores if you like, rather than countersunk. So I'll get these 3 screws in place. With them all in place, I'll tighten them up. That's the case back together. Now if at this stage you notice that you've got a greasy fingerprint or something else on there from handling the parts, you can wipe it off with a bit of naphtha, no problem at all. I haven't lubricated the speed trains on this mechanism plate yet, and I need to do that before I reassemble things. I've got some graphite powder here loose in this container, and I can use that. This is just the overflow basically from when I've been doing this job before. So what I'll do is tip some into the speed train here, and I'll work that in. That'll just see to it that the moving surfaces run with minimal friction. I'll just rub a little bit into where those pivots are too. It'll only take a flake in there to make a difference. That'll be fine. That mechanism was moving smoothly anyway. The self-timer or delay action, that's basically the same thing. This of course moves quite slowly. I don't think that the pallets here really need anything. So I'll now blow away all the excess graphite. You do not want graphite powder getting loose inside the shutter. It'll end up on the inside of the lens and cause you problems. That's why graphite's a great lubricant, but you use it when things are clean and dry, not when you've got oily surfaces about, otherwise it'll clump up on the oily surfaces and cause you problems. Okay, once this is all blown out, we can put the shutter back together. Let's make these 2 pieces back together. So, what do I want to do? Well, I want to unhook that spring, swing this out into the blade's open position like that, flip it over and start stacking my blades in place. I've got 5 blades. They need to go in the correct order. Okay, to get these shutter blades in place. Now I've marked the frame, marked the shutter here, so I know where they go. Number 1 here, number 2 here, number 3, number 4 and number 5. The blade actuating ring is in the open position. So I start with blade number 1. Blade number 1, the little tip of the blade will go down. So blade number 1 goes here. Blade number 2 on top of it here. Blade number 3 here. Blade number 4 here. Now all the blades are, the first blade and the 5th blade have their tips bent. Here's blade number 5. Blades 2, 3 and 4 are identical to each other. Blade number 1 has the tip of its blade going downwards here. Blade number 5 has the tip of its blade coming up. So those blades are all in position in the correct place, and I can put the case over the top. Now I'm looking at the distribution of the holes here in the case. They're closer together in this point, matches the case here. So we'll lower this over the top. Make sure my screw holes are all lined up and put the 4 screws in place. I'll put 2 screws in to start off with, and I'll do them up lightly. The reason I want to do that is to check that the blades are actually in the correct place and haven't fallen off their pivots. If they've fallen off their pivots, they can get trapped between the pivot and the case and get damaged. So it's always worth checking before you tighten the screws, or indeed even bothering to put the hole 4 in, that the blades move freely. I'll check again. Looks good. I'll fit the return spring to the blade actuating ring lever. You can see that the blades are nice and snappy. I'll tighten the 4 screws up. And check that it still moves freely. And it does. So that part appears to be good to me. Okay, move on to the next bit.